What's up, bookworms? This is Megan coming at you with another Cantina conversation. Today's episode features a chat with Joan Leegant. We are talking about Displaced Persons. That collection of short stories is available now. And as usual, such a great conversation. I appreciated how just open Joan was about her answers, and I felt comfortable just getting real, getting in some deep issues and just the reality of the human experience. But either way, I'll let you guys get to it. Here is Joan. All right, so today we've got Joan Leegant. Today we're talking about Displaced Persons. That collection of short stories is available now. Joan, thanks so much for chatting today. I finished this book a few days ago, so it's like still fresh in my brain. And it was, with short stories, oh, I could just put it down and pick it back up and not worry about, I could just use my time, read 20 pages or 10 pages or whatever, and then start a new story. But then on the other side of it, there's, oh, I want more. I like the short stories, and I always have try to have an open mind, even knowing that I might get a little cut short every now and then. But so I'm excited to dig deep today.
Thank you. I'm thrilled.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you give like a summary of the collection so that people can get a good idea of what we're talking about today?
Yeah, sure. It's always hard to summarize a collection of short stories since it's not a single storyline like a novel. But even with that said, I can tell you that when you put together a collection of short stories, you do need to find a title. And theoretically, that should at least suggest some kind of thematic coherence for the whole book or cohesion. So I named it Displaced Persons after one of the stories in the book. I could have used other titles, but one of them is called Displaced Persons. And by that, I meant I found out that the stories were set in two very distinct geographical areas. So I divided the book by East and West. And the people in the East, which is mostly situated in Israel, their displacement was these were people from lots of different countries. They were physically displaced. These were refugees from Africa. They were people coming from Russia. There were people from Thailand and the Philippines. So that was the displacement there was more physical and geographical. The other half of the stories are set in the States, and those people are not physically displaced, but they're more internally or emotionally displaced. Some of them live in what we might even call the land of the mentally ill, or they are displaced in their own homes. They don't belong in their families, kind of thing. So displacement became a kind of big umbrella for where you feel at home, where you feel you belong, and that became the title. So the running theme, loosely, very loosely, through all the stories is that they have something to do with belonging, where what feels like home, what is home. So that kind of thing. That's the overall tone. Overall, but that said, the stories involve all different kinds of characters, men and women and children and young adults, and they're told in first person and third person, and they live in California or New York, or I don't know if there's other parts, most of the East and the West of the States, and or New England and New York. And the Israel stories take place in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And yeah, and then they involve younger Israelis, older people, American expats. And so it's a whole range of people and situations. So not one situation, but an overall loose theme that might connect them all in some way.
Yeah, and as a reader, it's I think when so I might have to look up the stories that I'm talking about because I know like I try my
Oh,
best to keep track of them. Let me make sure because I know there was a handful of favorites, but the first one, it was like you started off strong. It set the tone for sure, and the whole idea of displaced persons, like what is displacement? There's different types of that, and even though, yeah, that's like the overall theme, but all these people are going through different types and they're trying to find their way there, or either a way of acceptance for themselves in where they are geographically, mentally, or either finding that contentment within themselves or struggling with
right.
not feeling that way. And so it's just there's so many layers there, and I was just like it was because that's why I was said about the short story thing, because I was like, oh, like before I have time to marinate one, like I starting to marinate the story, and then all of a sudden, oh wait, like it's over. Like so if you pack the
Yeah,
punch and then you're like, okay,
right.
I always wonder about how authors do that, like writing a short story, like how do you decide,
Yeah.
okay, that's a good or a way to that's a good way to stop if I want to like get the most emotional pull out of it, make the most impact out
Right.
of it.
What's interesting, you mentioned that first story, and I realized as I was talking with other people, all the stories were like this, that what looks like the main point of the story it's really often just an entryway to go into more depth behind the story. For example, that story is called The Baghdadi. It's about a man who moved from Baghdad to Israel in 1962 during a cut in the Middle East. And you
Right.
think, okay, the whole story is about his removal, living there, being different, and coming from a country during a certain volatile period. But the story also turns out to be about his, not displacement, his estrangement from his father for 50 years. And not to be too much of a spoiler, but part of the story is about this. He says something to this woman who is part of the story. The narrator is an American woman who happens to be there. She doesn't like him, but they're struck up
Yeah.
a and she finds him annoying. But he says something like he's still in exile. And she says, I thought you said you felt like you belonged here. What do you mean you're in exile? And he says there are many kinds of exile. And it turns out what he meant was there was, okay, it was his choice. He moved there 50 years ago because of what was going on geopolitically and where he felt he belonged as a Jewish person in Iraq. But his exile was also from his family. And that turned out to be, I didn't know that. I'm one of these people who writes without having any clue what I'm going to write about until it's on the page. So it's a little nerve wracking, but on the other hand, the discovery is really fun for me, and it's part of the reason I do it. So I didn't know that's where it was going to go, but all the stories end up taking me there. Like someone said, there's a number of stories about mental illness and in the family, and his son with mental illness, and yeah, that's part of the story, but it also allows me to explore beyond that, not just what it's like to have a son with mental illness, but in one of the stories it's how much this woman will go to save her son's life, even if it means forfeiting her marriage. So each of these, whether it's a geographical setting or a situation in the family, that's level one. But then behind it lurks yet another level. And how I get there, I have to tell you, Megan, I don't know. It's like I go there through associative thinking. I can't go there through cognitive thinking. I was trained as a lawyer, and I was a
Okay,
lawyer.
there.
I started writing fiction when I was older. I was 40. And my brain was always very organized and control everything. Lawyers control stuff. Everything's very rational. You outline everything. That does not work for me when I write fiction. So I have to turn off that part of my brain and use the strictly associative sort of dreamlike brain, which I actually
Mm.
prefer to be in. It's just they don't get along too well, those parts of my brain.
Yeah.
They don't communicate.
That's so interesting to me because I does a good segue because I did want to get into your background because I was looking at your website, just learning a little bit about you. And it's really cool that a lot of these stories seem to stem from like just various experiences from both your professional and your personal endeavors, just like something that you experience with your fascinating travel and growth and all that. So I want to get into that, like how the fact that you were a lawyer and then you were like, I'm going to do a 180 here and do a different type of like writing. And I think like even writing creatively still requires some critical thinking, but it definitely uses the parts of your brain that as a lawyer you don't have to get into. So I want to go into your background if just to explore that.
Yeah, so definitely. So I was thinking I'm always like revising the story of my life. I'm never really sure how to explain myself because you look back and you think, I don't know, it could have been this, could have been that, lots of different reasons. I became a lawyer and it was voluntary. Nobody held a gun to my head and said, oh, my parents weren't pushing me. It was, and I'm of an age where I went to law school when they were really heavily recruiting for women because there weren't a lot
Okay.
of law school when I first went. So it was okay when I went to a college where it was like you expected to enter a male profession and all that kind of stuff. And I had always been writing as a kid. I wrote poetry and everything, but honestly, to be a writer was just not on my radar. It was just either too out there. And the few times I had tiptoed into it, I remember taking a class when I was a teenager in some summer program, and they picked on a couple of geniuses in the class and said, oh, you're going to be it. I wasn't one of them. So
Oh.
I very quickly, okay, retreated back into. Plus, I was a cautious sort of kid, and I always thought I should have a responsible profession and make a living. And back in those days, it wasn't prohibitively expensive. Now it's like outrageous to
Mm,
get student loans and stuff through college, and I worked through law school, and I could do it. And I always was very responsible in my family. So the lawyer thing fit. I like public speaking. And I used to sit around and write poetry, but it was super closeted. I would do it in the dark, under my covers, late at night. I didn't tell them. My mother knew, my parents knew, and they didn't discourage it. But I myself couldn't even put that out for now. So it took me a long time. And I worked as a lawyer. But there were already clues because when I was in my late 20s, I left my job. I had a nice job, and I left and I went to Israel. I went on a trip, and I remember thinking, "Oh, I'm Jewish. I should explore these roots." And I remember my boss at the law firm saying to me, it worked for this only other woman in the entire county, and she said to me, "If you don't want to be a lawyer, you don't have to leave the country." And I remember thinking, "No, no, no, that's not the reason." Actually, it probably was the reason. But I couldn't admit it to myself at that stage. I was 28 and I thought, no, I want to be a lawyer. And I went to Israel thinking I'd stay about 6 months, and I stayed there for 3 years. And I didn't work as I worked a little bit as a like legal researcher at the beginning, but then I gave piano lessons. I was editing people's English, bad English some professor's paper. I wrote music. I played music in a pub. I actually had a great time. But I got sick and I became ill and I ran out of steam, ran out of money. A guy broke up with me. I'm at a stage where I can't hold it together
The
anymore. So
universe was trying to tell you,
yeah,
"Eh."
I went back to the States reluctantly and I got another law job. And speaking of the universe, though, I should have remembered. I once wrote an essay about it. When I went to take the law school admissions exam, the LSATs in college, I got a sneezing attack. I mean, out of nowhere. Walked into the room, sat down, started to like compulsively
Oh,
sneeze.
no.
And I had to leave because I was disrupting everybody. And I
Yeah.
went outside and I'm not sneezing anymore. So you'd think I learned a lesson. I didn't. I went and signed up again. The next time I go take it, I fell asleep during the exam. It was like my brain was trying to tell me, this is not for you. But did I listen? No.
Oh, no.
I had a few hints along the way. Like I say, I left it for a few years to go overseas. I came back. I got another law job. And then the truth is, I stayed in that job until I had a baby. And I had a very supportive husband who said, Shucks, I thought I was marrying a lawyer. Like now
Mm.
you'd be an unemployed writer. But it took me a while even to write after I left the law job. I painted, I took care of my baby, I had another baby. And I didn't tell anybody I was doing it. And then I tiptoed into some like writing classes in my community. It took me a long time, but I knew I had to do it by then. It really was helpful to have a supportive partner because it's not easy to walk away and you don't have much of a source of a livelihood. Eventually, I began to teach writing, but that was took later. I got a master's in writing and I published a book. And I hadn't published a book yet when I began to teach, but then I published a book, so I was able to teach. But that took a while, and that was modest income too.
Sure.
Yeah, so I was lucky on that score. Not everybody can afford to do that, and I know.
Yeah, it sounds like you were really resourceful
Yeah.
because I don't know, did you since from what you're telling me, it doesn't seem like you had much of a plan when you went
No.
to Tel Aviv and or Israel, and so I think it's funny how you're like, "No, we're gonna make this work," and I'm really enjoying myself, and I'm like, you probably learning a lot and getting in touch with
Yeah,
yourself and like your background and things like that, and so I thought that was like the universe maybe on that other hand was helping you make it happen, giving you the resources,
yeah,
helping you find ways to sustain yourself out there
yeah.
and to stay out there, and then coming back. But then you think about that, maybe you had to go through some things and have some experiences before it was time then for you to I'm gonna do this now
Yeah,
kind of
totally,
thing.
totally,
Yeah.
and it's interesting 'cause when people meet me or even when I sometimes, quote, "meet myself," I often think, "Well, I'm not that adventurous and everything," but the fact is I've been lucky that I was able to say to myself, "Just go, you have no plan," and in those days too, the great part was I was 28 when I went to Israel, and I was already a lawyer, I wasn't like a kid, but the good thing is, in honesty, there was no email. My parents they were like, okay, goodbye, see you in a year, whatever, see you in
Yeah.
6 months. We used to send airmail letters. I didn't have a phone in my first apartment. Not everybody had a phone in those days. So it was like, I had an enormous amount of freedom that my own kids never had. No one was calling to check up on me. And I like that. It allowed a certain kind of exploration and freedom that you're on your own and find jobs. And I like the freedom of being able to say, like, all right, take this job or that job. I felt really freed from the pressure to be a professional, which again was self-imposed, but there was a lot of freedom in that, combining the freedom to just, again, not be on anybody's email, not be on anybody's phone, not, and to see who I was again all over. And it was a great thing. It had its downsides. I was a little bit destabilized at times. I got quite ill
Sure, yeah.
because I gave up my identity. Like I wasn't a lawyer anymore, and I explored all kinds of things that were a little bit psychologically. I questioned a lot of things that were going on in my life, and
Mhm.
but it didn't give me a real firm footing at times. Who am I? Where am I going to live? What kind of person do I want to be? Do I want to become? I became interested in religion for a while. That was trippy and interesting, but it meant a lot to me because I grew up Jewish, but not a lot of content to that. So I wanted to explore it in a lot of depth. And then I pulled away and said, okay, I don't have to be super religious, but I tried it out for a while. I tried out these things and then I came back. It's been a kind of interesting journey in that regard.
Yeah, yeah, and I was never like, I don't know, I totally see where you're coming from because I was, like, raised Catholic, but it just depends on how much you feel like inside of you, I feel like if that's important to you and if that's gonna really guide your life, because I think for a minute, I was trying to lean into it, but then it was just like, it wasn't. I think the whole fact that it's institutionalized just kinda turned me off a little bit,
Yeah,
and
totally.
the older that I got, I'm like, pro-choice, that's just a
Yeah,
black and white, that's black and white for me. I just, if you don't, it's like, I'm gonna always be pro-choice, and unfortunately, a lot of all that, those institutions there, it doesn't matter, it's womb to tomb. So it's, I don't wanna get on anybody. I don't try not to judge anybody who's want there's an important
right,
part in their life, but it's just for me, it's just didn't quite fit, and my life didn't feel, it doesn't feel like anything's missing. So it's,
right.
yeah, like you tried it out, you went to the motherland essentially,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then you were like, "No, there's so many other things that are a part of this."
And I wanted to, when I was a kid, I liked it because I liked the music, I liked the singing, and I liked the poetry involved. My family was really uninterested. My parents were second generation. Their parents were immigrants. They had a kind of very common American Jewish identity, which was, okay, we're Jewish, but nobody wants to be religious. And so they didn't teach me, I didn't know anything about it. So I wanted to find out what it was because I couldn't understand, like, why does it matter if I don't know anything about the substance of it? So I dove in and I really enjoyed learning about it and checking it out. And then I said, okay, enough. And I pulled out. But I wanted to, like, at least learn what the tradition was or what the history was, a little bit about who I was, what my long genetics were, like my roots, really roots. But my way was to dive in. And also, because I was a lawyer, there's a lot of Jewish stuff that was interesting to me. Like the Talmud is a legal document. I wanted to learn about like that kind of stuff. I knew nothing about that. If I had been raised with it, I married a man who was raised with it, who then said, I don't want anything to do with it. Because for him, it was indoctrination, like you're describing.
That's what I'm wondering too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's something different than, yeah,
Oh,
if
yeah.
your family was super, like,
Yeah.
educated and reverent and
Right.
raised you with all that information and practices, you probably would not have ventured off on your own to seek more.
Correct.
Yeah.
And in fact, my parents thought I was nuts. I'm now they're not alive anymore, and I can say it, but they were worried. They thought I was going off the deep end. What is
Oh,
that?
no.
It was like they couldn't wait to get rid of this stuff. They grew up with a little bit they only grew up with not a lot of restrictions, but a little bit of obligations or you have to
Sure.
this or that. They thought I was nuts. And actually, I should say, even my siblings thought I was a little nuts. Like, why are you taking on these rules and everything? So it was not a plus in my family. They thought one person I remember thinking, I think you might have joined a cult. It was like,
Oh,
no,
no.
this wasn't a cult, but it seemed odd to them. Like, why would I suddenly want to eat kosher food and that kind of stuff, which
Sure.
wasn't part of our upbringing. So the opposite in a way. For some people, it had been a heavy, bad restriction, and for some of us who had none of it, said, "Hey, let me check out if there's meaning here." And I
Yeah.
ended up, in all honesty, I ended up putting a lot of it in my fiction. My first book is another collection of short stories. It has a number of characters who are like spiritual seekers. So I stopped being religious myself, but I wrote about it.
Yeah. It's a way to connect with readers and try to, like, not necessarily therapeutic, but just
Right.
explore what that might look like, and a way
Yeah.
to connect with people through these stories, like, through
Yeah.
experiences of your own. Like, you're not pulling it out of nowhere. It's
Right.
something that you are questioning yourself and you went through.
Right.
No, that it just reminds me of, yeah, my dad, him and his siblings, they all went to a Catholic school, and I think my grandfather was a maintenance worker there, like the head of maintenance or something. He was a little tight, like a little tighter ship there, and
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I remember growing up, and then we started going to church, and my dad was like, he never came with because he was like, "I did my time." I don't.
That's right. That's right.
So that's the perspective I'm getting from it. What is it, something like you have to do? Or yeah, it's tricky because it's, if you look at it from, oh, just this, like, just to have some guidance in your life, that's one
Right.
thing, or what, just to have that, maybe that little component into what makes you you, like, that's one
Right.
thing. But if you feel like it's an obligation and you're dreading it, and then you're
That's
just like,
right.
oh, but I was like, I'm not a good person if I don't, like,
Right.
do these things, or
Right.
it's like the trick of, like, how do you approach it, and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
That's
Yeah,
right.
absolutely. Like, what you're gonna get out of it.
With what I used to call pediatric Judaism, which is like it's like going to Sunday school. And you get a few
Mhm.
Bible stories, you get a few of this. And then if you're at all a thinking person at a certain point, you say, okay, thank you, I'm done. Because there's not presented to you as anything meaningful out of it. So that was part of it. I also thought there's some wisdom in this material, and there's a lot of ethics, and there's a lot of study, and there's a lot of stuff you could learn. That was part of it. But I didn't go there with that intention. I
Sure.
went there, as I was describing before. I took a trip when I was in my late 20s. I had a boyfriend. He broke up with me. I had vacation time coming. I'd never been there. So I invited my mother, who, of course, would say, oh, anything to go with my adult daughter. My father didn't want. We go on this trip, and I'm like 27. Everybody are all these divorced or widowed women and my mother. It's like women's trip, and we go around, and I was interested because the country, it was 1977, and the country was still, it wasn't as developed, and it had more of its kind of socialist beginnings, so it was a little more communal, and I just thought it sounded like, and it was more rough. It was a younger country, and it wasn't so settled, and
Sure.
you could, like, do different things. Everybody was out hiking, and the climate was beautiful because it's the Mediterranean. It was warm, and all
Mhm.
handsome guys. There's something about it, I thought, and I went back thinking, "Oh, I'll just spend a little time there." I had no intention of getting into the religion. It was after I was there for a while, and I thought, "Maybe I'll check it out." I'm one of these people, it seems that I was following my nose, and
Mm.
that's what I did there. So, it was a good experience.
That's, yeah, that's fun that you were like, "Yeah, I might as well." I would imagine, like, if I was in those shoes, I would have been like, "Oh, it's gonna happen one way or the other," kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, it seems like you were just, "I'm just gonna go and see and check it
Yeah.
out." Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And also, in looking back on it now, so many years later, I sometimes think I was 27, 28, and it's not that, like, I was against getting married or having a family or anything, but to be honest, that wasn't, like, my main. I wasn't one of these people who thought, I wanna grow up and get a
Yeah, yeah.
it was like, I really wanted to, like, I don't know, just explore a lot of life. I eventually did get married, and I did have kids, but I was well into my 30s, and it was later. Yeah, so
Yeah,
that.
I think you did it right. I think that's the way you should do it, is even if that is the plan, don't use your 20s to, like, continue growing up. You're still growing up. But once you're, like, in your 30s, then maybe, even though unfortunately the clock is ticking for women, I feel like that's okay. If you're 30 and you, oh, now you wanna maybe settle down, or even
Yeah,
then, even if at 30 you're like, "I'm not sure if I'm done exploring yet," that's okay too. But I imagine in the 70s or 80s, it was, like, probably just way
right.
more pressure, and
Yeah,
yeah.
there was, but and that you're absolutely right, and I think that I remember because I had my first child, I was 35, and my next one was 37, and there was a Latin word in the. I forgot what it was in Latin for the way they designated me and the other woman in the
It was,
same.
like, geriatric?
It
Is
was like
that what it was? Which sounds so.
exactly, it was like geriatric mother, and I remember
Yeah.
even my doctor told me, the obstetrician, he said, "Most of my patients are your age," but that's an old term from the world of obstetrics. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was that pressure, but I was pretty fortunate. I was the youngest of 3 children, and my parents had given up.
Oh, the baby of the family, we're not
Yeah,
as you as they
yeah,
are with.
"Go do what you need," whatever. So I had, yeah, I agree with you. I'm glad it shook out that way, and
Yeah.
that's how it worked for me anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's, no, I think that wasn't a bad order to go about doing
yeah,
things, for sure. And I
yeah,
love that you were just, "Oh, I just ended up being there, and then, oh, I guess my time here's up," kinda thing. Let's
yeah.
go back to America, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I needed help. I got pretty sick and I had to come back, and my parents were very nice and they helped me recover. And then I said, "Okay, I gotta get a job." And I took the New York bar exam at that point, thinking maybe my parents were from New York. I thought, because my previous work had been in Massachusetts. I thought, "Oh, maybe
Mm.
I'll settle in New York." I took the New York bar exam the next day. I said, "No, I don't think I wanna live in New York." I went back to Massachusetts, and I got a law job there, and I did that for
Oh, that's so
years.
funny. Yeah, you're like, "No, thanks."
No,
But
then
that's good that you were like it seems like you were confident enough in yourself that you felt comfortable. Like, you knew yourself enough. You're like, "I'm not gonna waste my time with this. This is not for me. I'm not gonna
right,
stress myself out over something where I'm like, I'm just my heart's not in it." Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. So, hopping around a bit, so did mention this was your 2nd collection. So, what was there any did your experience in between these 2 collections, like either writing or publishing, were they different? Were there any big lessons learned that you helped that helped transfer and you kept in mind the 2nd time around, stuff like that?
Yeah, actually, I had a first story collection, and then I also published a novel, and then I published
Oh,
this
okay.
this is actually the 3rd book, but there were long gaps between them, and, the first book I published 20 years ago, and then I took 7 years, and I published a novel, and 7 years after that, and then it's been, like, 12, 13 years already since the novel, and in those 13 years, I wrote 2 other novels that I'm still working with, these drafts. I've still got them under in process, and I like to say wrestling with them. One of my friends says marinating. I don't know what they're doing. They're sitting in drawers, and I'm trying to work them out. But so I was mostly focusing on those novels, but I was writing stories on the side because I really love writing stories. And I just published them one at a time in magazines and literary journals. And then while I was working on these novels, I thought, where you get no feedback other than occasional read by an agent who says no or fix it or whatever. I was sending these out, and they were getting published, and I thought I have enough for a collection. While I'm still working on these novels, I'll just put this collection together. I did it that way, and I didn't the first time I had an agent and I worked with her, she sold it for me, but she passed away. And instead of looking for a new agent, I was waiting to finish a novel because agents prefer novels. So since I didn't have an agent while I was working on these novels, I thought I'll send this story collection out to small presses and to literary contests where you don't need an agent. And I did. And it took some time to shape it. And I took out one story, put in a new one, reorganized it. And then I sent it to a press out where you live, in actually based in Milwaukee. And they had a literary contest, and it won the contest, which was really exciting. They had 500 entries, and it won.
Oh, wow.
That's how they pick the ones they're going to publish. They publish 3 or 4 books a year: poetry, fiction, nonfiction, one other kind of book, and that's how they pick their fiction books. It was a great experience because it was so affirming. They said, out of all these, and they had a wonderful judge named Weike Wang. She's an amazing writer, and the stories, the book was judged anonymously, didn't have my name.
Oh, okay.
So that was cool. They just judge it based on the stories alone. Doesn't
Oh,
matter.
yeah.
And what I also liked about it was these stories are about people who many come from many cultures. A lot of it is about clashes or attempts for different cultures. And Weike Wang's work, she's a Chinese American. She has a PhD from some science, biochemistry in Harvard, and she's also published 2 novels, and her short stories are published in the New Yorker. She's like a brilliant writer. And I wrote to thank her after I found out that, I won the prize, and she was the judge, and thanked her. And she said, "Oh, I liked your stories." And I thought they're universal themes, people from all cultures trying to adapt in other cultures, and
Yeah.
resonated for her too. So the publication story for this was really very nice. It was, there I was wrestling with a couple of novels. Been a long time since I'd published one, and life had intervened. There were a lot of things that were going on with my family. And then this publication was just such a gift because it was a prize, and the publisher has been really lovely, and they made a very nice book. And so that was very nice. And so the stories are quite different from the first collection. And one of the differences is that I never wrote in first person, and I seldom wrote about women. And this book is
Yeah.
filled with first person women's stories. And I think it just took me a long time. I was more comfortable writing about men early on. And I'm not sure why. I used to say I have more distance on men, but I actually think part of it is writing about women was a little close to the bone for me. It took a little more years, a little more guts.
You weren't sure if you're ready to go there.
Yeah, exactly. And you think, oh, what's the big deal? But and it's not like they're filled with personal confessions, but it just took time to be able to write this kind of material. So the stories changed over the years. The things I became preoccupied with changed too.
Yeah,
So
I can see that because 'cause I'm like yeah, 'cause I think it's really interesting the way that you mentioned before how you formatted the placement, like,
yeah,
you split the story in between
Yeah,
the West and the East, or the East and the West, and I thought that was so interesting because it's I imagine that even if it wasn't, like, super tied to religion, obviously the
right,
displacement specifically amongst Jewish people,
right.
the Jewish population are just an overarching thing, even if in when it comes to America, that doesn't dominate who these people are, it's just it's more of a second, which I thought was, like, totally reflective of, yeah, this was the focus, this was such a big deal in the East,
Yeah,
but then once you get to the West, it's like that feeling of identity versus physical, like,
yeah,
calling a physical place home. It's who am I okay with who I am? And that's what made, like, some of the obviously, the ones from America are gonna be a little bit more relatable, but
yeah,
also, like, just how the vast difference in the stressors
yeah,
and their, like, internal like, external versus internal obstacles and struggles and like that. Because a couple I think one story in particular was I forget what it was, but it was, like, where the teenage boy and
yeah,
his brother struggling with his mental illness a lot, and it was just like it was, like, heartbreaking. I think it made it more heartbreaking because, one, it's almost like you're watching a slow train wreck,
totally.
and then second is because they're teenagers, and this is his brother. It's I just like, where you went with some of these ideas, I just thought it was just so many interesting layers to and just absorb the context and to consider, like, the psyche of someone who might go through that, and so I thought it was really interesting how, because yeah, you said, like, some stories you were in first person, but other stories you didn't.
Right,
Right.
right.
So, I, like, maybe explore that. Was there a method to your madness? Was it just, like, your gut instinct, things like that?
So it's interesting. That story was one of the oldest. I started that story a long time ago, and it took a lot of years for me to feel like I got it right. And it's about those two brothers in Queens, New York. And I think the thing about the mental illness stories, it doesn't really matter where they're back, it's all the same. Everybody, not all the same, but I guess what I mean is who they were, what they were struggling with, their family life and everything. That's just the means for exploring what it means to be a. It's really a story about brothers, and it's about the pain of a family where the brother loves his brother, and he has to watch his brother. Like you say, it was a slow train wreck. That story, whether it's a first person or a third person, is really a matter of like voice and sentence, and it's literally the first sentence comes to me and I hear it one way or the other. I never purposely make one or the other. It's literally how I hear it. And that story started with that first sentence, whatever it is, and it's in the third person. And I've often, when I teach, I say to people, at least for me, unless the opening comes with a strong voice, a sense of who they are, or
Sure, yeah.
it fails. But this came with an attitude and a set of feelings right at the beginning. And I knew right away it was a story of the two brothers. Part of it is famous writer, I think Flannery O'Connor or something, said, if you've lived through if you live through a childhood, you have material for the rest of your life. So exploring the feelings in a family, first of all, comes naturally to me, partly because I think to be a good writer, I've told people, because I've taught people of all different backgrounds. I said, it doesn't matter how big your vocabulary is, whether you spell well or how good your grammar is. You have to care about people. You have to have empathy. And I'm porous. I go around feeling a lot. When it can be a little exhausting, and yet that is what you need. You have to feel for other people. And so I'm in there feeling what these brothers are feeling. I still cry myself with some of these stories, and I feel for these brothers, and I feel for the one who's mentally ill, and I feel for his brother who can't save him. And I feel for the
Yeah.
parents who can't save him.
Yeah.
That's what interests me in these stories. It's someone said to me once, there's a lot of sadness in these stories. I said, yeah, some of them have humor, but it goes to a lot of hard places. But I think that is part of life. And I turn to fiction to find that out, because you're not going to ask your neighbors,
I
like,
know.
how's it really going in your life?
I know, yeah, I
Well,
know.
yeah, you
There are
can't.
times, like, even when I have conversations with authors and I'm like,
Right,
sometimes, like, "Yeah, we gotta dig a little deep here," and I'm like,
yeah,
"If you don't mind talking about it," I always try to, like obviously, if they know it's like a one-on-one interview, they know some subject matter, they're
right,
hopefully prepared, but yeah, it's exactly it. It's like, how
right,
do you I'm not usually one to pry anyway, because I always trust that, like, hopefully my friends and family, if they wanna talk about it, they need to talk about it. I
right.
hope that they know, like, I'm here, and if they don't, then I don't know if I have no way of knowing if there's something more that they need for me to feel comfortable talking to me. It's just because 'cause I'm not really asking doesn't mean that I'm not here for you. You know what I mean? So I could sympathize with that, how you said you're like, you're empathetic, but I think that's just what makes you a good writer, like, just really digging in there and really it sure for sure helps you to connect with readers to
Yeah,
as a storyteller,
yeah.
for sure.
And also, I think, but when I would teach, I would often say to people, "Why do you read? Especially, why do you read fiction?" I think the answer, people say, "Oh, I want to learn about new things." That's all true, but I think a lot of it is like to find out the truth about life. And it's funny because some people say, "Oh, I don't want to read fiction. I only want to read the truth." But I think it's interesting, like through invented characters, you find out the truth of how life is lived because like I say, I'm not going to go digging into my neighbors' issues with their children or whatever, but fiction allows both the writer and the reader to explore how life is really lived. And now, some people approach it with either sarcasm or cynicism. That's totally not my way. I have a lot of compassion and affection for all my characters. I'm not, for some people, it works to write out of sort of, edge and snarkiness or whatever. That's okay, but it just doesn't work for me. So it's both my need to, I also am one of these people, I don't actually know how I feel or think until I write it. So I go in there just like a reader, like what's going to happen and who are these people? And then
Yeah.
when I'm done, I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't know it was in there. So I'm glad it connects with the readers, but I'm really partly doing it because I don't even know what I'm going to uncover until I'm in there. And hopefully it works for the reader. Um,
I It works for you, that's your method, right? It's don't mess with your process if that's what happens with that.
yeah,
I love that. I love that your honesty there. You're just like,
yeah,
yeah, to be truthful, I'm not quite sure.
yeah. Yeah, I have a lot of friends who teach. I read a lot of interviews with people who teach and writing and stuff. Most writers will tell you that even if they plan it out ahead of time and map it out, even if they've got it all worked out in their heads, they depart from that for the most part. You
Yeah.
kinda have to open yourself up to, it always sounds very woo, like the characters tell the story or the story tells you what to say, but you do in a way. You have to follow the sentences, follow the characters. There's a writer named George Saunders who writes about this a lot, and he says, "You gotta get out of your own way, and you gotta leave your intentions at the door." You might say, "Oh, I'm gonna sit down and write about XYZ." He has a great interview where he analogizes it to being on a date. He says, "Look, you don't sit on a date with an index card that says 8 o'clock, compliment her outfit, 9 o'clock, ask
Yeah,
about her,
right.
10 o'clock, best love." It just doesn't work that way. It's the same. Like you, I'm not one of these people who can work from a plan because when I do, it's just flat. It's paint by number. So I have to give myself over to kind of zone in a way, but it makes for kind of a lot of anxiety. I eat a lot of M&Ms, and I don't get
Yeah.
where you're sitting there like not having a clue. But to me, that's the better way to get at kind of the truth in the lives you're trying to uncover or discover out of some need that you have for yourself to write people's stories. I don't know where that comes from, but it's some people have it.
Yeah.
People have other drives. They want.
Yeah. No, yeah, you gotta do what you there's a
Yeah,
reason why you feel that desire,
right.
and yeah, if you weren't, like, trying to publish a story, even if you was like, you would still be writing these stories, you would still
That's
trying
right.
to be figuring out these parts of yourself. Yeah.
That's right. And I think there is a difference between journaling and writing to create publishable work, but they're all along a kind of continuum. And some people paint and dance or
Yeah.
bake or sew or do something to give expression to some creative interest or urge. And so some people do words. So that's how I view it. And I'm happy when people enjoy the stories because I hope that it like means something to them. Less about me, more than for them.
Yeah, just reaching out
Yeah,
and just hoping for, like, an open-ended discussion almost. Yeah.
exactly. And the other
Yeah.
thing I learned with my very first book is once you let it out there, it's not yours anymore. It belongs to the reader. People find stuff in the stories that I don't know is in there, and
Yeah.
they're often right. They see things in there, and I'm like that as a reader. I'll see things in other people's books. So it's a cool thing. It's the same. I learned that also. I went to a couple of artist colonies and I'd listen to painters talk about what their process was. I remember once asking someone about like, why'd you have this? Why'd you have that? She said, I thought the canvas needed red. And
Yeah.
oh, okay. And
It's
whatever.
it could be just, like, the simple
Yeah,
basic, like, that's how it went through their mind
yeah,
versus trust me, and then the viewer might see more
Yeah.
meaning to that. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. I remember one guy, as a matter of fact, he talk about like displaced persons. We were at an artist colony in New Hampshire. He lived in Queens, New York, but his parents were from Argentina, and he and his grandparents had moved to Argentina from Europe. And I didn't know any of this. And we go to his open studio one night, to see his work in progress. And he has all these airports and these doorways of embassies and all this stuff. And someone says, "So why do you think you have airports?" He says, "I don't know. Interested
Yeah.
in travel." And we said, "Wait a minute." He had told, we knew about his family background because his parents once called and they had Spanish accents. And he explains, "Oh,
Sure.
yeah, they're from Argentina." Point was, he wasn't seeking to paint about being my people who had migrated all over the world, but all of his paintings were about that. It wasn't a conscious choice on his part.
That's yeah, that's funny and wild. It's
Yeah,
just
it is.
something. It's just like it explains maybe the human brain. Like we don't even know. We don't even
Exactly.
know. Yeah. Getting back into the stories part of it, because I'm, like, interested in what this might I'm just gonna throw it at you.
So
What were the most challenging stories to write or story to write, were the most enjoyable story to write?
some of the most enjoyable were the ones that had jokes and humor. I really, people see me as pretty heavy and serious, and I am as a person, but I love humor. And I've often thought, oh, if a story is fun and funny, it's probably not any good because it was too easy or something. There are a couple of stories here. One in which someone's cracking jokes is called The Innocent. These both involve older men and roots. There's like these grandfatherly types and their adult daughters. And I had a lot of affection for these older men in these stories. And I don't know that it's necessarily a relationship like I had with my own father, but they were certain types and their daughters had nice relationships with them. And there's a lot of, and their way of relating with one another was often through a light kind of humor. And I enjoyed writing those. They were fun. And in one of them, he's a kind of older guy and he makes a lot of, he's called Roots, and he connects with his daughter, marries a guy who has a 13-year-old son, and the son becomes interested in old Jewish gangsters and convicts and stuff. And the grandfather type like likes to feed
Yeah.
that to him. So I had a good time writing that. Those were a lot of fun. There was, and the other one called The Innocent, where their family just can't help cracking jokes. And it turns out that the narrator is a woman who's getting divorced. Her husband couldn't stand her sense of humor and divorced her almost over it. It wasn't really that. It's just that it showed that the guy wouldn't give this woman a break. He couldn't even bring himself to laugh at her jokes, and that's when she knew it was the end. Cut her a little slack. But I enjoyed that she made up jokes, and I even made up one of them. I found a lot of my those were fun because I could use a little humor, even though they were serious stories, but they had humor in them. One of the hardest ones to write, in a way, was is easy. It came fast, but it was very personal. It's called Bus. It's about a mother with a son who's having cancer, and it won a prize. I was really surprised because
Yeah.
I really thought the story failed because I wasn't sure if it was clear on the ending. But I never wanted to write about that because I have a son who did have cancer, and sitting through his treatments was one of the most difficult things to do as a mother, where it was like he said, and it said it in the story, like, no drama, mom. Like, and I
Yeah.
it
Oh.
did. And in the story, I wrote how like the woman sits there and stares at the same page of the magazine hour after hour, week after week, which was true. And I just never thought I would do that. But what happened was I was teaching a class. It was one of these classes where people write during the class. You have 15, you talk, you read, you do prompts, you do exercises. And then there was like a 15-minute writing session. And I would always make it a point to write myself during that time because I would say to the participants, be bold, be fearless, don't get up from your chair, don't be afraid, take whatever comes. And I had to put my money where my mouth was.
Yeah, there you go, yeah.
I started to write about this unusual bus, which was a true story. There was a bus that was decorated with stuffed animals that I used to ride to the job I had. So I wrote about the bus, thinking, all right, I'll just write about the bus. And the story yanked me away into this memory of sitting with a young man getting cancer treatment. And I had to stay there in the room with the other.
Yeah.
So in a way, it was almost like written against my will. On the other hand, it was a short, very short story, and it had a lot of feeling, and it got published. And like I say, somebody gave it a prize, and that was nice. But it came out of a part of me that like was reluctant.
That's oh god, hearing that your background behind that just makes that story so much more powerful. Because I remember, yeah, I was like, "Oh, it's short." It was like, "Wait, oh, that's it?" But I was still like
Yeah,
that was one of those stories where I was like, "I needed a second. I needed a
yeah,
minute because it was just it was so impactful, and then it just
yeah.
it ends, like, really impactful too. It's just like such a powerful him just saying, "Just let go. It's okay to let go." And I just or just don't like you didn't need to keep like he the son became the comforter. And
Yes. And the says
I
to the mother, which I really I have to tell you, Megan, I didn't know that was coming when that came out in that sentence. When he turns to her, because this didn't happen in real life, although I had evoked my son, who's a very empathic person, but it didn't actually go down that way. But when he says to her, "You can stop pretending for me,"
yeah.
because that's what she was doing. And it was like, took my breath away too, because I thought, oh my God, that's the point of this story. He became the comforter to her, but she didn't want to burden him, which is
Yeah.
I, that's how I felt with my son. And I learned that with the son with cancer. And I've talked to other mothers and parents. The last thing my son was 23, and that was the same age as the young man in the story. The last thing they need
Wow.
to do is deal with your problems. You're the parent. Don't lay it on, oh, I'm so upset. Hey,
I know. I
right?
know.
So you have to hold it in and hold it together.
I know. I'm a mom of 2 small boys right now. They're like 6
Okay.
and 3 and almost 7 and 3.5. And I this he's gonna be in 2nd grade and he's asking these questions, like, he's curious and it's just it's just so natural, and I try not to have be visibly upset or be visibly, like, stressed out or whatever. Obviously, I get angry with them if they're, like, not listening, they're just being crazy kids, and I'm, like, frustrated. But then still, I try to be like, "You know what? I don't like yelling at you guys. I'm sorry for losing my cool. I just get really frustrated when you do A, B, and C and blah, blah, blah." And then they're just, "Okay." Hopefully, that'll resonate later on. But because I feel guilty. Yeah, for that reason, like, they're not like someone that I should be venting to. They're not
Right,
someone who
right,
needs to like even though their brains aren't necessarily developed to even handle their own emotions and regulate their own emotions.
right.
They're not going to understand on a deeper level like I'll just there was just one time I think I was a little bit more honest with him. He was like, "Mommy, I was talking to you. Why weren't you answering me?" I was like, "I'm sorry, honey. I'm just a little distracted." And he's what? And I'm like, "I'm just a little bit upset. I'm in a weird mood." And he was like, "Why?" I'm just like, "Okay, how much do I tell him?" And it was just something about I think I was just like having body image issues. And how do you explain
Right.
that to a 6-year-old? I was like, "I don't know. I guess I'm just not feeling like good about my body right now, but I'm gonna work on it." And I think I just left it at that. And I don't think he really cared to dig deeper into that either because he just
Right,
left it at that too.
right,
But yeah, it just reminds me of oh god, because the whole body image thing. It's like yeah, they're not girls, but it wouldn't hurt for them to hear a good language about that too.
right.
But yeah, it's one of those things where it's as the parent, it's really hard to not like where are you going to channel that and to
Yeah,
not like if that I can imagine with you and your son if he knew probably how hard it was for you and
right.
but he didn't
It's
but
harder
he
for him.
yeah.
And this whole thing reminds me, like, because there's another story that was also it's close, emotionally close, which is the story called Hunters and Gatherers, where the mother has a really bipolar son who goes off and comes back and everything. And that story, what reminds me of what you're saying was that's also a story about a mother who, like, she'll just do what she has to do. And at the very end, that the other thing that struck me when I wrote that, he's home. He goes on his manic runs away, and then he comes and crashes at home and literally crashes, hangs in the basement, can't come out, is in one of those terrible things. And his car is missing. And in that story, the car comes back and she's worried he's going to go off again. And at the end of the story, she has a little plan. She's going to like take that car and go hide it. And there's a line at the very end where she says she knows it's just a teaspoon in the ocean, a way to keep him safe a moment longer. Really, because the guy has such severe illness. So if she takes his car, and the line that struck me when I wrote it was almost like she knows it's just a teaspoon in the ocean, a way to keep him safe a moment longer, but this is the moment she has. That's
Yeah.
yeah. You can't really save them. But if you have a moment, do the thing you can do, even though it's just a teaspoon in the ocean. That's one of the hardest things I've learned as a parent. And it honestly, it's hard when your children are young and it's hard when they're older too, because you always want to save your children and you can only do what you can do. But if you have a moment, you do it. You do what you can in that
Yeah.
moment. And it's all very difficult, like what you're describing too. How much do you let your child know how hard it is to be their parent? know?
I
And
know, and I get to worry so much about what I say and
yeah,
within earshot, right? If I'm just talking, or even if like if my husband and I are like disagreeing on our approach to things,
yeah,
or if he is expecting more from me, or if I'm expecting more from him, and like that kind of exchange, I wonder and worry a little bit. Maybe we should be a little bit more careful about how much they hear it. You know what I mean? Because they're hearing their parents working through something that maybe should be figured out behind closed doors, like,
yeah.
not in front of them, and
Well,
yeah.
you also want a model that may not have all the answers or that things have to get worked out. It's just there's I guess I don't have any great answers, to be honest.
No, I don't think we're supposed to, it's
Yeah,
okay.
I guess my feeling I've heard this from, like, older people from me who would pass it down, and I get the feeling that if you do what you do out of sincerity and love, including making colossal mistakes. I once heard someone asked Toni Morrison, she was already quite old, and they said to her, "So do you have any regrets in life?" And she said, "How can you get through life without regrets?" And I thought,
Yeah,
"Oh,
yeah,
it's, like, crazy to say you can't. You make mistakes. That's we're all human." And,
yeah.
oh, the
It
kids
really yeah, yeah, that kinda reminds me of something similar that I heard. If you love the shit out of them, it's really hard to mess up.
Yeah,
It's
that's
hard to mess up if you just love that, like, you because
that's
then your everything will come from that place,
right.
and
Right, including the wrong moves, but they know
yeah,
you love them, and then sometimes one of my jobs was working as a lawyer. I worked in the Department of Social Children's Services, child abuse stuff and everything, and I remember I felt terrible for a lot of those people, not only the victims, but even the people who were perpetrating that abuse. They couldn't help it. But it also made me see, okay, there's a big difference between making a mistake when you're doing it out of love, or even losing it with your kid, yelling, or
yeah,
maybe you hit them sometimes. Don't say that, that could be a terrible thing to do, but it happens, like people lose it. They throw something at their kid because they've lost
yeah,
themselves. But if they know you love them and that you sometimes can't, you know, you can't be perfect all the time,
yeah.
counts for a lot. I just
It
think,
really yeah, I think, yeah, that's a little bit of comfort may or just yeah, like you said, like reassurance to them, maybe even not now, maybe years from
yeah,
now, they'll realize, you know what, like it's normal to get upset. These emotions are valid. It's just coming to terms and recognizing if you know how you carried out those emotions were
yeah,
like,
yeah, absolutely.
no, yeah, it's just like realizing that.
Well, somebody actually asked me in an interview that I just, in writing and said something about it seemed to be efforts at repair in these stories. And I realized the last story is about an adult man and his sister
Oops.
who she did awful things. She couldn't help it when she was young. And he was angry for good reason. And they had a little window right before it was too late. And they made an effort at repair. So that's also part of the life stories that we have that it's never too late to try to mend a relationship. And it's like what you just said. You might be able to have to say to your kids later, I've said to my adult kids, I'm sorry I lost it when you were 12 or whatever, or I was
Yeah.
having a hard time or whatever. I guess I have to believe that there's always hope for some kind of repair. You hope for that.
Yeah, exactly. Because otherwise, I'm not sure
Yeah,
that's what else do we have? We
exactly.
can't
What else
just hope
can
for
you
that.
do?
Was that the last one, the one that you're
Yep,
talking about?
yep,
Yeah, I remember wait, like, that's, like, what I'm talking about, like, when I finish
yeah,
these so many of the stories that when I come to that last 2 paragraphs or last page, it's I don't know, it's like the it's like leading up to it, and that's the hardest punch, and then it's
yeah,
done, and then I was like, "Oh shit, that's the book. Oh my god." 'Cause, yeah, it was one of those 'cause, yeah, it ended where it was like,
yeah.
that was the effort, right? That was the point, and that
That's it.
it's
Right, right.
yeah, and it's yeah, you learn some things, you do a little bit of introspective soul searching, things like that. How is that
Yeah,
what's really important here? Yeah, and the brother was totally, like, justified in his anger and his reluctance to, like,
yeah,
reconnect
yeah.
or yeah, like, patch things up or repair before it's too late, and it's hard because it's like you're running out of time, unfortunately, and
But
it's
when you're hurt, it's logic doesn't prevail. It's I don't want to open that wound.
yeah,
And it was his wife who said, because he wasn't nice to the sister when she first arrived, and the wife who
still
said,
there.
"Don't leave. He doesn't have
What?
time."
So, Joan Leegant, what is next for you? Are you working on anything that you could talk about?
Yeah, I have a couple of, as I mentioned earlier, a couple of novels that I've been working on for a bunch of years. Probably one of them I might keep in the drawer, but the other one I'm going to take out And now that it's had some distance on it, work on some more. And I've also been writing some personal essays for the first time, like in the first person mode already, women's
Mm.
stories, whatever. So I've been writing some of those first person essays about different things. Like one of them is called What If, like a choice of a career thing I never did. And now I'm looking back and wondering, oh, how come I
Oh.
didn't do that? Or why would I even have considered it back then? It was something I would never think of myself doing. A few things like that, looking back on pieces or like where I grew up and a little bit about that town and things like that. So I have some interest in exploring that now. Somebody once said when you're at a stage in life when there's more years behind you than ahead of you, you start looking at almost like trying to understand. You lived your life, but you're trying to create some kind of better understanding about the choices. So I'm
Yeah.
working on some of these days, and we'll see.
That'd be fun. I imagine, yeah, you just continue learning about yourself. You might
Yeah,
surprise yourself, who knows? Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Interesting to discover.
Okay, so Joan Leegant, Displaced Persons, that book is available now. Joan, such a great conversation. I feel like we could have gotten carried away for much longer than an hour just chatting it up. And I enjoyed learning about your fascinating life and like your processes and how these stories affected you and things like that. And if and when you are publishing your other works, feel free to keep in touch and come back and we could chat some more.
I will. It's been a real fun time to chat with you. I really appreciate you having me on your program. Thank you.
And there you go. That was Joan Leegant talking about Displaced Persons. That's a collection of short stories written by her. That collection is available now. Check out the show notes for where you can find links on to purchase the book and to find Joan on social media and online. Find Cantina Book Club while you're at it and follow me, subscribe, all that good stuff. It'll help me out and help me reach more readers and more listeners and more bookworms just like yourself. And if you need book recommendations, please check out cantinabookclub.com. And if you are finding books that you'd go ahead and hop on over to Goodreads and Amazon if you can and give them a rating and a review. It really does help the authors out. And as always, thank you guys so much for listening.